Hello, everybody. Wonderful to have you come out tonight. And this is a very informal, really a talk story session. It is not a formal debate. It's not going to be like Vance and Walz or Harris and Trump or Biden and Trump. Sometimes we have used the word debate, but really it's a much more casual get-together, and it will be focused almost exclusively on your district. And I will go through a couple of housekeeping rules. Of course, this is House District 38, which covers portions of Mililani and Waipio Acres and Mililani Mauka. We do have snacks. Please help yourself. We do not have water, and I don't know if there's a water fountain nearby. I apologize, but there's probably one nearby, but it's really quite wonderful. Please silence your phones. I don't mind if it's on vibrate, but we don't want any phones ringing, and that includes mine, because we are recording this, and that's why we have the microphones and the camera there, because we will be posting this on our website at a later date so that other people in your district can watch and see what we had to say, what the candidates had to say. I will be asking the first half of the questions, depending how many there are. They're coming from me, so I'll take credit or blame for those. But we are also very much encouraging you to ask questions. And to do that, we don't give them a microphone. I'm sorry, but we've learned from past practice, and I'm sure anybody that's gone to a community forum has seen this. Someone gets up to ask a question, and they spend 10 minutes making a statement. We've all seen it. We don't like that here. And the way we do this is we have index cards. And so the staff in the, what color is that shirt?
Olive.
Olive green, sort of a military issue. So that's Asia over there, and that's Courtney in the middle, and that's Ashley. And they have these index cards, and they have pens. Just print. Don't make them super long. Try and get to the point, and then they'll bring them up to me and hand them to me, and I'm the filter. I'm the guy that's going to decide whether it works or not. I do, however, discourage, personal attacks. We are here to hear their ideas, their thoughts, and certainly they will be able to respond to what each other says or not. But this is really a gathering and a talk story, as I said. And then just a couple of other things. Please sign in if you haven't already done so. We do that so that we keep track of numbers, but also we can keep track of you. We're not going to use it to bombard you with spam. Bathrooms are through, I probably use that door over there, and they're right to the left, and they've been unlocked. And as I said, we'll probably go about an hour, depending on the flow of questions. And then at that time, you have an opportunity to come up and say hello to Alexander, say hello to Lauren, talk story a little bit, meet and greet, and say hello to us. We'll be busy breaking down and trying to get back to Honolulu. I have to be up early on Hawaii News Now at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to give you a little tip. We have a pretty good breaking story tomorrow. I can't tell you what it's about, but I'll give you a hint. It's about Amy. Can I check and tell my hint? She's so busy texting. I do want to introduce our new editor-in-chief. This is Amy Pyle. She just joined us from USA Today, and she has a guest visiting from Santa Rosa, California, Jeremy, correct?
That's right.
And so it was great that they came out to join us as well. And one final thing, as I said, just be civil. We really want to be kind. This is not PBS Hawaii. I'm kidding. I'm on PBS Hawaii all the time. Okay, my first two questions, I'm going to start with Representative Lauren Matsumoto. And these questions for Alexander and Lauren are kind of related. I've known Lauren for a long time by virtue of covering the legislature. I have not met Alexander, but I know his dad, Ryan Ozawa. I briefly knew your late mother as well. And Ryan is heavily into social media, and I'm sure is very proud that you're running for office. But Lauren, let's start with you. And these questions are kind of two sides of the same coin. If I understand correctly, you began service way back in 2012. I'm getting this from someone's bio, maybe yours, at the age of 25. So you were just 25 years old when you got into the legislature. That's very, very young. I think Tulsi Gabbard might have been the youngest person.
21 years old.
21 years old when she got in, and look where she's gone, two different places. So I wanted to have you give us some perspective. Looking back, what's the advantage to having a fresh voice, a new voice? And at what point is it time for you to step aside for newer, fresher voices to come in? And this is the new voice versus experience argument. So the first question is to you.
I'd like to still believe I have a fresh voice, but I understand the question. And I think the question really should be not necessarily fresh voice versus experience, but really what type of voice are you bringing? So a lot of people know we have the most unbalanced legislature in the entire country. Out of the 76 legislators, there's only 8 in the minority party. And so often we see bills just going straight through without conversation, without being checked, or on the flip side, bills never being heard in committee. And so I think what I bring to the table is that ability to have a different voice, to be able to make sure that we're voicing the opinions of many who don't get represented in the legislature. And that's really what needs to happen. That balance is so, so important to make sure we are passing sound policy.
Okay. Very good. And Alexander, this is not to be demeaning at all, but I understand you're just 19 years old. Is that right?
Actually 20 now, so.
Okay.
We have the same birthday, Chad.
You're kidding.
That is true.
What is the birthday?
August 16th.
No way. This is really uncanny.
Leos.
I learned this through social media.
20 years old now, and I didn't check the age limit, but is it 20 to qualify to run for?
Yeah, you just have to be 18.
Okay. So I guess my question to you is sort of the reverse. Why not wait a little bit? Why not get a little more experience versus why you think you should be elected to replace Rep. Matsumoto?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the current record holder was 21 years old when she was elected into office. And, you know, when asking around on whether or not it would be a good idea for me to run, that was an option that people gave to me. And, you know, I felt that if you ask the average person, the average voter, should there be someone really young representing any area in our legislature, the average person would say yes. Now, I am totally sympathetic to the idea that, you know, if I was 40, 50, 60, and I came home after a long days of work and I saw something on my door of a college-age individual who's asking to represent me, that would be, you know, a hard ask. But I feel that in the time that I've spent at the legislature as a staffer for the Ways and Means Committee, that I've had a great opportunity to learn about the legislative process, the administrative process, the state's finances, and things like that. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw my hat in the ring and ask my fellow neighbors for their vote.
No, that's great. And I should have really said that. Your bio. By the way, we have candidate Q&As for both Lauren and Alexander up on our website. We feel it's really a public service, and I'll tell you this, particularly as the election nears, and as you know, the ballots go out. I think it's October 18th. Is that next? That's next week. I think it's next week because of early voting, mail-in voting. But Alexander's a student, former Senate budget analyst, so you were on Ways and Means, is that right? And then also a member of the Mililani Neighborhood Board, and a large member. And then with Lauren, I already mentioned 2012, but also a member of the Women in Government National Board of Directors, Women's Legislative Caucus, served in the Salvation Army, and a few other things as well. I wanted to be sure I got that in there. But related to this, what about this notion of term limits? Because it comes up all the time. Right now, there are no term limits for the state legislature, not for the House, not for the Senate, but we do have term limits for every other office, really. The county level offices, mayor, council, prosecutor, although there may be an exception for Kauai, and governor and lieutenant governor. But at the federal level, again, no term limits for the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, but term limits for president and vice president. So I think we'll reverse it. Alexander first, and then Lauren, the pros and cons in your view of term limits.
Yeah, well, I actually have to say that my position on this has evolved. Since in the Q&A that you mentioned, I think I took a hard stance pro-term limits. But, you know, from your fantastic reporting, I learned that the representative has in the past introduced a bill to cap term limits to 12 years. And had that actually passed, she would not be able to be running against me right now. And if you ask me, a lot of people do feel properly represented by the representative. So in my opinion, she should be able to run. So a little bit, my opinion has a little bit evolved. I think that the people can indeed be able to choose who they want to represent them if no other candidates step up to the plate.
Okay, Lauren, is that correct? You are a sponsor of a bill to...
Yes.
What were the dimensions, if you will, for the House and the Senate?
Yeah. So I'm a strong supporter of term limits, and I've introduced several bills. I've had a 12-year term limit bill. I've had a 16-year term limit bill. I've also introduced a lot of government transparency bills, all 27 of the Foley Commission suggestions, because it's a real issue in our legislature with government transparency, with the positions of power that we have, and there really is an imbalance. And so I've been a strong supporter of term limits, and unfortunately, all of those bills that I've introduced for government transparency haven't ever received even one hearing in committee. And like Alex mentioned, I would have termed out at 12 years, but the work's not done because those bills aren't being heard. That movement isn't happening. There isn't that will within the legislature to make any of those government transparency moves that have been suggested by the Foley Commission and others. And so it's something that I've been talking about at the legislature, I've introduced, and when a bill like that passes, I will gladly term limit myself out because I think it's so important to make sure we do have different fresh voices, but we're not having those conversations even in committee, allowing people to put their testimony in how they feel about things like term limits. And so it's something that I think is really important, and I'm hoping in the legislature we actually have it go to committee more than just the Judiciary Committee where it dies a silent death and nobody ever gets to even vote on it. Again, it's that transparency issue.
I should just note, if you don't know, sometimes I just play teacher. The Foley Commission was the commission led by, oh, no, that's quite all right, retired Judge Dan Foley. This was set up by the House following the J. Kalani English and Ty Cullen bribery scandals. Of course, both of them were high-ranking lawmakers, then later went to federal prison. They're both now out. But the commission came up with these ideas, and many of the bills did pass and come in, or actually now on the books. Not all of them did, and we've written quite a lot about that, but I appreciate you clarifying. I do think it is interesting whether a body would actually vote to limit itself. I think that's kind of what the fundamental question is, but that did happen at the counties. Second question, this is also coming from the candidate Q&As. I'm going to read the question, and then I'm going to ask Alexander and Lauren, I think we'll go with Lauren first, to sort of elaborate on that. It has to do with that big tax cut that happened. How do you feel about the massive income tax cut just approved by the legislature and the governor? Do you have any concerns that it will force reductions in state services in the years to come? And this was heralded arguably as the most significant accomplishment in the 2024 session. The dollar figure on how much that's going to cost, it's pretty high. It's in the billions of dollars, and it's over 5 or 6 year period. So Lauren, I think you had said this was long overdue. Maybe we could streamline our operations in order to find savings. Please elaborate.
The tax bill that was passed, I agree, was long overdue. I had been pushing for years to have an income tax reduction. Our state here in Hawaii was one of the highest taxed states in the nation. And we talk about cost of living day in and day out. From when I first got elected to now, when you talk to people, the number one issue is cost of living. And the legislature really didn't do anything significant when it comes to income tax until this year. And so I think that it's something that is going to benefit so many people in our state when we said we don't really even have a middle class anymore. Everybody really is living paycheck to paycheck. And so this was something that was long overdue. And something else that we need to do, I've introduced for many years, but we need a financial database in our state. If you look at a lot of our systems, they're antiquated. And so many of the departments, the systems do not talk to each other. And so there is money that goes missing all the time. For example, when I first got elected, I got $500,000 for a bike path in Waialua. That bike path took many years to build because that money went missing. DOT told me they didn't know where it was, and $500,000 they couldn't tell me that was appropriated for the bike path. It wasn't used. All of our systems can be up to date. I was on a task force for IT when it came to our state. And so pushing things like a financial database to really streamline our operations will go a long way. And I know the governor has also talked about vacant positions in order to handle this tax bill. But if we're talking about what can the government afford versus being able to help people who are living paycheck to paycheck, who have to depend on that money to come in to keep their families going, this bill was monumental. Okay,
Alexander, I'm just going to summarize or paraphrase even. This bill helps working families in particular. You don't see it cutting services, but your take on this. really huge tax cut. The biggest one I've seen, maybe in state history, is how it was sort of put out there.
Yeah, well, your question was if I had any concerns, and when I worked at Ways and Means, we spent a lot of time on it, a lot of work was put into it, and as you said, I don't feel that there's too much of a risk of state impacts to our state programs. If that turns out to be false, if the numbers don't end up the way that we thought it would, then of course it would be incumbent on the legislature to properly convey that to the people. Why were we wrong? How is it going to protect our state services? And how are we going to make sure that we don't make a bad bill like this? Yeah, so HB 2404, I was very glad to see it pass. I was very glad to have a part in helping it happen.
It's interesting because this was also the year that we doled out a whole lot of money from Maui recovery. Yes, there's a lot of federal help, but a significant amount of money from the legislature to help Maui recover. There's always pay increases for public sector unions. I believe there was another tax cut. I think this is something Republicans have pushed for and finally convinced. Yeah, so the general excise tax is our property tax, or excuse me, our sales tax, right? That's how the state gets most of its money, because it's really placed on everyone and everyone that visits here. And for the first time, and maybe Lauren can explain it, I'm sure because you're on WHAM, you know all about this, there is an exemption for medical services, not for groceries. There was talk about exempting groceries, is that right? And maybe some other things. But this did pass, and it's to help, as I understand it, really help people that are providing medical services, particularly in rural communities on the neighbor island, where it's really difficult to make a living. If I got that summary wrong, either of you, I guess, go ahead, Lauren.
So this was also another monumental bill. The problem is we didn't go far enough, in my opinion. So we only exempted the general excise tax for Medicare, Medicaid, and TRICARE. So it is not for all medical services.
TRICARE is for veterans.
Thank you. And so I have pushed for the last decade to have medical services exempt. And I think we need to go back next session and also do all medical services because multiple reasons. One, medical is a need, not a want. So these are something that will directly help our families. And the other big thing is we have a physician and nurse shortage here in Hawaii. And one of the biggest issues they come back with is being able to be reimbursed and being able to provide those services. So it will not only be a tax break to the citizens here in Hawaii, but also to those who are providing the medical care. And so something that's extremely important, especially when you live in the middle of the Pacific and you can't just drive somewhere else to get your medical care.
What do you mean by other additional medical expenses? I mean, are you talking about drugs? Are you talking about visiting the doctor? I mean, a lot of this stuff, there's insurance laws and whatnot, but is that what you're...
So it'd be visiting the doctor. Prescription care is already covered and is not taxed. But the thing is being able to visit your doctor. So your doctor is taxed and you're taxed on when you're going on that visit. And so that's something that's extremely important. Hawaii is one of the only 2 states in the nation that tax medical services. We are in the small minority. And this is something, again, I'm glad we took that first step to exempt Medicare, Medicaid, and TRICARE, but we need to go all the way and exempt all medical services. It's good for the people and it's good for the doctors.
Okay, Alexander, to you.
Yeah, so I'll agree that we should look into exempting medical services from the general excise tax. For food specifically, this is something that the minority party has repeatedly introduced to the legislature, but it's never panned out in getting a bill passed. And I think the reason for that is it sounds like a really great idea, but the problem is, in practice, it is at best complicated. I have a essay here from the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization that comes to the conclusion that food should not be exempted from the general excise tax. For among other reasons, I'll quote, exempting food purchases would primarily benefit higher income households and affluent tourists and would not produce a more equitable tax system. So the problem with exempting food from the general excise tax is that it's a little bit just too broad, and it allows our tourists to benefit from that tax policy. So what I would do instead is expand the refundable food excise tax credit. Currently, it's mostly for low-income families. I feel like we could expand it to our middle-income families. And in terms of beyond taxation, there was a great appropriation this past year for the Department of Agriculture, which allows our people on SNAP or food stamps, basically for the DABUX program, DABUX program. The program steps in when local families buying local produce, they get half off.
And these are cooperating stores. I think Time
Yes.
Foodland, maybe on the Big Island. I think it's KTA, and it's DABUX, BUX, correct?
Yes. Yeah, and so that solves or helps solve a lot of problems. You know, it's our lower income families getting assistance at the till. It's helping our farmers move more products, get higher sales, and it's also reducing our dependence on imports and keeping our dollars here in Hawaii. So I would not vote yes on a bill that exempts food from the general excise tax, but for some of our other policies, I would be happy to basically do the same intent, but just be a little bit more precise.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for me looking at my phone here. It's my watch. It's got the time on here. This is moving amazingly fast. We're almost through the first half an hour. And by the way, the first question that came, one of them was, do you think our state should have term limits? Done. Took care of that one. Let me move on to another question. And this comes from the state's election guide. The state just published its general election guide for the general election November the 5th. We have our own guide on Civil Beat, which also links, as I say, to the candidate Q&As. But each candidate was asked to provide a brief blurb and a photo. We don't use the photos, but we have photos in Q&A. But this is something that I learned about both of you, and I want to follow up a little bit on it because it has to do with education, a very important issue. I'm quoting, Lauren proudly attended Mililani schools and went on to receive her bachelor's from the University of Hawaii, a master's from Hawaii Pacific University. And then I'll get to Alexander. Well, I'll get to it in a minute. But essentially, my question to you is, are you satisfied with what the legislature has done in terms of funding both the Department of Education and the University of Hawaii, which, as you know, are always key points? The DOE in particular is about $2 billion. It's the largest, usually the largest single expenditure out of our budget, if I'm not mistaken. And the university is no small habit, but there's always these fights over funding. Are you satisfied, particularly given your credentials?
I'm not. I think there's a lot of issues here in Hawaii when it comes to education, and we're very unique. As many know, we are the only state that has one centralized Department of Education. There's pros to that because we have neighbor islands that have much smaller populations. So if you funded it through like county property taxes like they do in other states, it might be a little difficult, but we've never taken a serious look in the last few years at what it would look like to decentralize the DOE. There's pros and cons to that as well. Additionally, going a little bit off the funding, Hawaii is the only state that does not have local school boards. And I think that's something that's really interesting because every area in our state is so different. A school in Molokai is very different than a school in Mililani, and what the needs are, what the wants are. And so put a bill in for several years to have not a whole bunch of little local elected school boards, but one elected school board per county. Because right now we only have one board of education that is appointed, not elected. That has shifted over the years. But I think it's really important for each of the communities to have input. So when it comes to funding, how does that funding get appropriated? How do our schools look? What are the educational needs for each area? And so that's something that we need to take a much stronger look at in the legislature.
The idea of school boards has come and gone many times. I know Linda Lingle, a Republican governor, pushed for it, was not successful. There may have even been a constitutional amendment. I can't quite recall. What's going to change minds because we are in the minority?
What's funny is when you actually talk with people and you don't say it's a Republican or Democrat issue and you talk about being able to have more input to your school district, when you just ask that question, the vast majority of people want to have input on their child's education. There's not a lot of access. It's very difficult to have access to the Board of Education meetings. I know it's all public, but it's not as easy as having your local school boards and having people who are elected and held a little bit more accountable to the conversations that they're having, the discussions, the decisions that they're having. And so it's also something that hasn't really been talked about a lot. And so I think it's an interesting thing if you just surveyed people, if they would like to have, again, not a school board for each district or each complex area, just starting with a school board for the county, being able to have a little bit more input because we have one centralized DOE. I think that's something that's really important.
Okay, I'm going to take it to Alexander. First of all, where are you in grad? Where did you go to school?
Yeah, well, I graduated Mililani High School in 2022. I'm currently part-time at West Oahu for public administration, looking forward to hopefully a lifelong career in public service. Not necessarily elected public service, but, you know.
Well, you served on WAM. You've seen the numbers for DOE, for UH. You also know that it is the state Senate that in particular has been very hard on UH, Michelle Kadani, Donald Mercado Kim, Donovan Dela Cruz. Your thoughts on this? How does it make you feel in terms of the funding for the DOE and for the UH?
Yeah, so I'll say that in the budget bill that was passed this past year, so I was the budget analyst, in fact, for both the Department of Education and the University of Hawaii. Much of what made it in the governor's budget ended out coming through in the final legislative budget. And in fact, the legislature added some things for the Department of Education that the governor didn't include. And I think those are great things. On top of that, you asked about funding our Department of Education. I believe that we should be paying our teachers more. You know, I'm going door to door. People tell me they're a teacher, and I ask them, how can we help our teachers? The single biggest answer is paying our teachers, making sure that it's a worthwhile job for their time, you know.
We're getting our bang for the buck in terms of test scores, though. Just a recent report we had on civil beat is that probably due to the pandemic more than anything that we always seem to have some troubles with the K through 12 public schools.
That's true, and there is work to be done in the state's administrative process to further support our schools on a school-by-school basis to make sure that they have the resources and capability needed to best assist our students, particularly our at-needs students, and more about UH. What I said about the Department of Education maybe wasn't necessarily the same goes for the UH. The Senate has, the legislature has as a whole been more critical of the University of Hawaii, and I do believe that there is an opportunity both for the legislature to be critical of the massive amounts of funding that is being requested, and for more resources to be going to our higher institutions to make sure that the students and faculty are well taken care of.
Okay, Chad, mic closer to your mouth, please. Smiley face. How's that? Pretty good?
Great, thank you.
All right, you got it. Alexander, let's follow up with something that came from what you said in the state election guide, and then we'll have Lauren, if she wishes, to respond. Alexander says that Mililani needs representation that will focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion for all of our citizens. DEI is the acronym. This is something that has been hotly debated, not just locally, nationally. You're hearing about it in the presidential elections. Tell me a little bit more about that DEI and why it's so important to have that representation.
Well, this is one of those things that I think unfortunately goes a lot back to the very partisan nature of national politics. I believe that if you set out a poll to Hawaii as a whole, or even District 38 specifically, if you ask them, would you support further protecting gay marriage, like the question that will appear on people's ballots this November.
That's right. There's a constitutional amendment question.
I believe that that would pass. But unfortunately, some of our, especially our Republican legislators, vote no on such issues. And I don't believe that aligns very well with the values that Mililani has.
Okay, Lauren, sounds like you were baited a little bit there. Republicans not going to vote for the Con-Am on same-sex marriage.
Well, what's so interesting is you see every election when there's a constitutional amendment, there are usually a whole bunch of ads. There's a lot of people pushing, vote yes, vote no. And on this issue, there hasn't been anything. There hasn't been ads. And so that's really interesting when it comes to something like a constitutional amendment. And what I hear is the issues we're really looking at is cost of living, housing. We need to be able to afford to live here. These are the issues that are most important. And even when I survey my district every year. And this last election, not last election, this last session, we received 701 surveys back. And the top issues was, number 1 was cost of living, 2 was housing, 3 was crime, 4 was jobs, and 5th was government transparency. And so those were when you poll the district, it is the things that they face day in and day out that are the top issues for them. And just interesting, again, that there's not a whole lot of ripple happening during this election for the constitutional amendment.
Did you want to say anything about diversity, equity, and inclusion? This is to Lauren.
In regards to
what Alexander had to say in his election guide, that we need to have more representation in this regard, in these categories.
And I think that comes out when people in our district, you already are seeing that in our district, you're seeing it in the schools. I think this is something that has been talked about a lot and is adequately represented.
Okay. Let's move on. This question is from the audience. Why do you think politics are so divisive, and what do you plan to do to help ease the divide? Lauren, and then to Alexander.
I've really seen a shift during my time in the legislature. When I first got in, there was a lot of respect and decorum. You could have different ideas, but you could still sit down and have lunch, and it was okay. And now we've gotten to a point where I've even had colleagues say, I can't be seen having lunch with you.
You can't have lunch with a Democrat?
Nope, they'll say, I could be kicked out of the party, or I can't post anything with you on social media. I can't be seen with you. And it's really sad that we've gotten to this point in our legislature where not even just in our state, it is countrywide, where it is an us versus them mentality. And when people are running for office, it's not let me put my ideas forth and let's have a conversation. It's let me jab into you. Let me tell you why, and the nasty sort of things that we see and talk badly about your opponent. And that's really, to me, not what politics is all about. It's about serving your community. It's about really pushing forward the issues that you think are best and that you hear from your community. And I think it's unfortunate. So the last 2 years when I've given my opening day speech, I have talked about respect and decorum and being able to have those hard conversations civilly, because that's what's really missing. And I had the opportunity to be part of a fellowship this year. They picked 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats from across the country based on our ability to work together with others. And I mean, the one thing about being the minority is I hear people say, I'm good at working across the aisle. There's no aisle here in Hawaii. I mean, honestly, if you're in the majority, you don't need anybody from the minority to pass your bills, versus to get some of my bills that I've passed this year, I need to have a minimum of 35 Democrats to come over to vote with me. And so
the House divide, is it 7?
Six out of 51. And in the Senate, there's 2 out of 25.
Okay. Alexander, healing the divide, the divisions between the two parties, you would be, if elected, in the majority.
Yeah, I would. And you asked about the rising temperature, not just locally but nationwide. And I attribute a lot of that to the rise of social media. It's so much easier for people to really capture your attention and make people who disagree with you not just incompetent, but intentionally evil. That is something that even within the Democratic Party, you see different factions, not just politely disagreeing with each other, but actually thinking the other faction, so to speak, is actively trying to do something bad. So what I would do is just try to lead by example. I try to be, a very thoughtful and careful person, and I would like to communicate my ideas and my thoughts and my opinions, not just with my fellow legislators, but with my community, not in little tweets, but in essays, try to pick apart the issues together so we can come to a conclusion that
Did I hear you say that you would use social media, the very thing that you identified as being in part part of the problem.
Well, I mean, I would maybe post a link to a longer essay or something, or a longer opinion piece. The issue I have with social media is that you see a lot of people just tweet out little jabs at people, and that is what I think increases the temperature.
Some of them actually own websites.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's
social media sites.
And it's not just the public's attacking the legislature. It is candidates attacking other candidates. It's legislators attacking other legislators. I have never seen before that type of interaction between colleagues, or even to the level it has become between candidates. And I just think, as like we need to rise above all of that. It's so important because we have lost the trust of the people.
Well, your point to setting an example, I think, is important. There were, in fact, there was a Democrat and a Republican in the House that got into. I did the story. Thank you. I won't name the names, but it's public. But essentially, social media, their disagreements were played out in public, and if I understand correctly, the House is moving to have a better social media policy. It doesn't really have one. Let me continue. Alexander, we'll start with you on this. It's kind of related. As we all know, there will be a new House Speaker by November the 5th, November the 6th. Essentially, that's when you switch it out. Even though you're not sworn in until January, the offices start changing. Scott Saiki is on his way out. It's probably Nadine Nakamura from Kauai. We'll see. But this is to you first, Alexander, because you would be with the majority. What if you disagree with your leaders in the House? What if you have an idea and push it forth? What if you had an idea for a bill and they don't like it? How are you going to publicly, or maybe it's behind closed doors, disagree with your leaders in order to help the people here in your district?
Yeah, well, this was a question that was in the Q&A, maybe not specifically about the speaker race in particular, but you know, I believe the words I used was ideal leadership is welcoming of dissenting voices. And if I felt like a prospective speaker had maybe a grasp of its caucus's expression, then that would be quite disappointing. So if I had a bill that I introduced and I really thought it was a good idea and it's just not going to fly in the legislature, I would write about it. Like one of those essays I mentioned, I would put it out just for public consumption.
You could submit something to Civil Beat. We might run it.
Yeah, that's a very good point, yes. Yeah.
Because it will be challenging. There are, as you know, there's 51 people in there, and we don't know what the numbers are going to be like. We have some key House races that could go either way, particularly out on the west side as well. Lauren, this really kind of goes to you next, because not only on how you deal with dissenting views, but you're also a member of the minority. Do you feel that that voice is dissenting, as Alexander said, is actually heard? Are you heeded by your Democratic colleagues, whether they're across the aisle or otherwise?
I think it's not so easy to go against leadership when you're in the majority. There is a lot more that happens in the legislature that nobody ever gets to see. And that's the beauty of being in the minority, is even as the minority leader in the House, I have often voted different from my caucus. Have that freedom to be able to make the decisions that I feel is best for Mililani, and don't have that power structure coming on me. Again, it's something that most people don't get to see if you're not in the legislature all the time. But it's there. People are told how to vote. People are often, they might lose their chairmanship position if they send an article to Civil Beat saying they disagree. And so there's a lot of different dynamics that happen within the legislature. And I think that's something that's really important for people to understand. But in the minority, having that dissenting voice is really important. But again, recognizing that it truly is, I'm going to call it a numbers game. If you want to get things passed, you have to be able to work with people. If you only have 6 out of 51,
26.
You need 26 in the House, and you need at least 15 in the Senate. And so I think one of the things that really speaks to my bipartisan ability is being able to pass legislation through the legislature. And there I believe I'm the only Republican that has been successful in the last 6 years to pass legislation through. And that is due to my relationships across the aisle. And it's not compromising what I think is best for our community, but it's being able to have, again, that respect, decorum, and relationships in order to get things passed, and was able to pass several key bills and resolutions, as well as bring back a lot of funding for Mililani this year due to being able to have those respectful conversations.
Let me push you just a little bit on that dissenting voice within your own caucus. There's 6 of you, but there's really 5 of you. Kanani Souza has been on the outs. She is not in alignment with you and Diamond and David and Elijah and Gene. And of course, in the Senate, the 2 Republicans, Brent Noah and Kurt Favela, aren't even talking to each other. They couldn't even agree who would be the minority leader. So how is it that you talk so openly about allowing dissenting voices, and yet you don't allow that in your own caucus?
Well, I absolutely do allow it in my own caucus, which is why Representative Souza is allowed to do or say whatever she would like, because she represents her own district. I do not try to stop her from saying anything, nor any of my members. Each of my members get to vote the way that is best for their district. And I will say it is harder sometimes when you have a small caucus, because every vote really matters. You can't create factions. You have to bring everybody together in order to move something forward. And I will say, in my time in the legislature, the minority caucus has been dysfunctional. And there has been infighting. But even if there's one dissenting member, we still now have 5 members that are working together, and that one dissenting member can still vote however she feels is best for her district. And I think that's what true leadership looks like, and that's what's needed in the legislature.
Along these same lines, a lot of people seem interested in this topic, and Alexander will go to you. Is it, quote marks, it really about Republican versus Democrat, or just poor legislative quality overall? For example, a committee chair can unilaterally kill legislation. Doesn't have to have the support of leadership, let alone their committee. So is it politics, or is it, I guess that's ego and power, another way to put it. Alexander.
Yeah, I found it very surprising when I first started working at the legislature that a single committee chair could, in fact, let anything pass or completely die unilaterally. I think part of that is a culture thing, and I think that's a big problem that is going to have to change, and I would support any policy to remove that unilateral power and bring it back a little bit closer to the power of the people.
Let me make sure I heard that correctly. If you get in there, you would vote to get rid of the power of a committee chair to unilaterally kill legislation. Did I hear that right?
Correct.
Very brave, I would say. Lauren, what do you think? Is that going to happen?
Not with the current balance that we have right now. I have my, I have my doctorate in organizational leadership, and we talk about cultural shift all the time. And I talked with our former speaker, I talked with our majority leader, who might now be the speaker, about how we shift the culture. Because like we mentioned, Republican bills don't get even heard. People from the community do not get the opportunity to even testify whether they think it is a good idea or a bad idea. And chairs can kill a bill or pass a bill just on their decision. And it is a horrible way to do things, because you're taking the people out of the process. They don't get to be part of it, and they don't get to say whether something is a good idea or a bad idea. One person gets to do that in the legislature. And that is not what policymaking should look like. So I've been a firm advocate in changing the House rules. I brought it up last time as part of the rules discussion. There was no movement on it. I will continue to fight for that issue, because I truly think that's what brings transparency. There's so many times a bill just gets deferred. I wanted to be on record voting yes or no on the bill, and it just gets deferred in committee, meaning it dies a silent death.
Meaning we don't know where
nobody knows what happens to it,
or where people sided in terms of what.
Yes.
Okay.
So you don't know how people will vote, but you also never get the reason as to why it's being deferred. I can't tell you how many of my bills have made it almost to the end of process, and they just die a silent death, and people ask why. And I go, I can't even tell you why.
This is conference committee, right? The mysterious last 2 weeks. And Alexander, I'm sure you've seen this. It's often wham, And the finance committee, I'm not blaming you, but I'm saying it's often the leaders of those committees that are making those decisions. And not only are we never told, but we never know how the lawmakers themselves would have voted unless they voiced it. Are you sympathetic to what Lauren is saying here about
the thing is
accountability?
the thing is about conference committee is that the leaders of the conference committees have already passed out the bill, at least for enough for it to get to conference. I think a big problem is genuinely the lack of time in the legislative schedule. In the 2 years that I've been there, I will say that the conference schedule has been a little bit too harsh, and I think a lot more bills actually indeed would have been passed if there was a little bit more time to literally just have those meetings.
That's a great point, and it brings me to a question I want to bring up right afterwards, and I can tell you want to say something related on this very same issue in terms of these. You say the bills have already been heard, that all these committees have heard them. There's been floor votes at least twice before it gets to conference, and then there's a final and third vote. But isn't it also true, in fact, that those bills can be changed in conference?
Yes, they can.
They can be amended through a conference draft, a draft that may or may not be shared with the public. And even if it is, there's no public input. And sometimes those drafts could completely change. So how would you respond to that? I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah, well, I believe that there was a Supreme Court case in the last couple years that made gut and replace bills. It put restraints on them. It is still a problem, and I would support any policy to make sure that the public has time to view and comment on any particular conference bill.
Okay, Lauren, you wanted to add to that?
I did, and it's not just conference committee. The killing of bills happens at every single step within the legislature. Bills even on the floor get silently deferred if all of a sudden there's not enough votes. It doesn't ever get voted down. It silently gets deferred. In my 12 years, I've seen one bill die on the floor. That's not a whole bunch of transparency. But when it comes to conference committee, it's not just the gut and replace. Changing a may to a shall, taking a sentence and changing it could drastically change what the bill does. And when you talk about the public not getting a conference draft, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in committee and I'm expected to vote on a bill that I've never received a conference draft. When we're talking about transparency, it goes so much further, and that's why I continue to talk about it. I advocate for it because it is something that is so, so important. I had 3 bills this year die a silent death in Ways and Means and never know why those housing bills died.
Imagine you're the reporter and you can't figure it out either. Alexander, I can see you grabbing your mic.
Yeah, from the producing end of what goes on behind the scenes in the legislature, I honestly believe a lot of our legislative, our elected officials from across the state are elected in good faith by their communities, and a lot of them are genuinely really good people. And our committee chairs, I think, would give their members an opportunity to vote on the legislation that they want to pass. The problem is that it is staff behind the scenes that has to very quickly, at the very end, in such a rush, make all of those drafts. And that is one of the biggest reasons why I would support a longer legislative session, just to give people and the legislators more insight.
To follow along those same lines, and we have about 10 or 15 minutes because I do want to be able to break so that you can come up and talk to the candidates, share your manao with Civil Beat. Did I mention the Chinese food? Please help yourself. The ledge meets mid-January to early May. You are preparing during the interim, particularly October, November, December, trying to get the bills together. But it is a part-time legislature, and there has been discussion of moving to a full-time legislature. That's a lot of time to be spending, particularly if you're from a neighbor island and having to fly over. You have to drive in from Mililani. That's a pretty good drive, too. But do you think there could be some, if you will, some negative impact were you to meet more often and have more time to deal? You would have to meet every day, of course. But do you think there might be a downside to having a full-time legislature? And I'll then ask Lauren the same.
Well, I think this is something that can be discussed. I don't think a longer legislative session necessarily means a year-round legislative session. Even, the amount of work that comes out in the last couple days of the legislative session is immense, and even just a couple more days could probably make a big difference, in my opinion. There is some concern over the cost of what that would entail, whether or not
because we'd be paying for it, all of us.
Indeed, yeah. And there is some concern over whether or not legislators would be voting on their own salary increases, if that would happen. Those are obviously very big contentious issues, but I think with a little bit more time, the legislators and the staff themselves could easily pay for whatever the cost is of a longer legislative session by being a bit more scrupulous with our taxpayer dollars and finding more places, like Lauren mentioned, where we may have lost track of money along the way.
Okay, full-time ledge.
This is something that I've debated a lot, talked with people who, from California who operate in a full-time legislature, or people from Texas who only meet every other year. And there has to be some sort of happy medium, because the time that you spend in the interim in your district is so important. Being able to talk with those in your community. When you're at the Capitol day in and day out, even if you only went in 3 days a week during a full-time legislature, you're missing that time that you're able to really talk with those in your district. And I think that's something that's so, so valuable. Something that I think can help is, we've talked about, we have legislative session staff. They're only there January to May. And so by the time you get somebody trained up, it's pretty much the end
like
of
Alexander, right? Yeah.
It's pretty much the end of session when they're finally kind of getting the hang of everything. Because the legislative process, I always laugh, it's not what they taught me in American civics in school.
It wasn't.
It's very, very different. And so being able to have full-time staff instead of maybe having 2 session staff, to have 2 year-round staff for the House is something that I think will be more valuable for taxpayer money, but also help us run more efficiently and maybe have a balance between still being a part-time legislature, but having more efficiency.
Okay, one last question from our readers, and then just very quickly a round robin session with short answers. This is directed to you, Lauren, but Alexander, you should have the opportunity as well. Trying to buy a house in Hawaii seems impossible. What can be done to fix it? Boy, affordable housing, it never seems to go away as an issue. Lauren and then Alexander, not too long, so we can get to these last questions.
This is one of the biggest issues that the legislature has faced for years, but really worked to tackle this last session. And so I introduced several housing bills this session. One of the bills that passed through the legislative session was the Hula May First-Time Homebuyer Bill. And that was a wonderful program that was implemented here in Hawaii to help those who are buying their house for the first time to have a low interest rate. You have to go through classes to teach you how to buy a home, what would be appropriate with your income. And the reason I'm so passionate about this was the only way in 2013 that my husband and I were able to afford a home. And unfortunately, 2013 was the last year that they funded Hula May. And so I have been advocating for years to refund the Hula May First-Time Homebuyer Program. And so this year, we have worked with the departments. That bill passed, and so happy that that's going to be something that can be there for our constituents. Unfortunately, and one of my top priorities is for the Individual Housing Account Program bill. It is already a program that exists. This is one, unfortunately, died in the last minutes, but this program already exists. The problem is what it is a pre-tax dollar to save up for a down payment. When you talk to people about home ownership, one of the biggest hurdles is down payment. And so they can afford the mortgage, but they can't afford the down payment. So we have this individual housing account program. The problem is it hasn't been changed in 20 years. You can only put in $5,000 a year of pre-tax money. So what this bill simply does is it changes it to $20,000 for an individual, or $40,000 for those who are filing taxes jointly. And currently the cap that you can save up is $25,000. I don't know who can put a down payment with $25,000. And so changing that to $200,000, which is a little more realistic to the home prices.
Homes, right? $1 million homes.
In Mililani, anywhere that you go,
my ignorance here. Hula May, is that like Sally Mae?
It's like Sally Mae, but for Hawaii. Hula May.
Got it. Alexander, affordable housing, and then I'll have just 3 final questions.
Okay, you mentioned this was round robin, so I'll
well, this is, you could have a little more time. Affordable housing is key, and then I have quick 3 round robin.
Okay. The Hula Mai program, I'd like to congratulate you on the passage of that legislation, the bill to for a report to continue the Hula Mai program?
It is to ensure that the Hula Mai program is implemented.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and that's great. And speaking long term, we've seen nationwide our governments failing to just build housing. In Hawaii, one of the biggest cost elements of building a new home, for developing new homes, whether it be single family or multifamily, is regulatory. It's not land, it's it is regulatory, and it is important for the legislature and the city council and our various councils to really work on that issue so that we can expand how many units that we have, particularly in urban Honolulu, in our urban core, in our more economically depressed areas, to make sure that, you know, we're on an island. We have to build eventually up and not out.
Okay. Real quickly now, the first question, traffic was a little busy coming out here during rush hour, particularly around the stadium. There's a rail line running now. What about a rail line extension to Mililani? It has been discussed in the past. For it, against it? Alexander and then Lauren.
For it. There's been a lot of, I think, mass transit has been a long time coming. Unfortunately, with this particular project, there's been a lot of people who've been concerned about the financial aspect of it, how it's been administrated. But that's, in my opinion, not a reason to be against the concept of mass transit. And eventually, we are going to have to look for ways to get people out of their cars and more in mass transit. And I guess that answers your question. For it, against
Lauren, extending the rail Skyline. It's called Skyline, right? To Mililani. It hasn't even made it to Ala Moana Center yet. It hasn't even made it to Kaka'ako. But what do you think about that idea?
You took my answer, Chad. I would like to see the Skyline work first. We don't even have the parking lot.
Skyline doesn't work? Is that what you're saying?
I was gonna take my kids on a field trip during fall break as the.
It's cheap.
But we don't even have the parking structure in Pearl City for those in Mililani to use the Skyline yet. There are so many issues that we need to talk about before we even consider a leg out of the Skyline. And I really think we need to focus again on that second city issue. People were talking about it all the time, making Kapolei the second city, so people are driving both ways. And then the Skyline, people will be going in both directions. There's a lot of opportunity there. Hopefully a film studio will go out next to UH West Oahu, so people can be coming from town to work at the film studio.
There's a film program.
There's an amazing film program. I'm a proud graduate of the Academy of Creative Media. I wish that program was there when I was going, I wish that facility was there when I was going to school, but hoping that there's going to be a commercial film studio right next to UH West Oahu, where people are able to use the Skyline stop right there. But I think we have to see success first.
Okay, penultimate, which means second to last question. This is my ignorance again. I don't get out to Mililani often enough. It's very pretty. I always enjoy it, besides the drive. But right now, there's a lot of discussion on tourism money. HTA, Hawaii Tourism Authority, having their funds essentially controlled by the legislature, because you guys changed you gave it to DBED, Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. But I guess my basic ignorant question is, do you guys get tourists here? Is tourism a problem? And by extension, I guess short-term rentals, Airbnb. Lauren and Alexander, keep it quick.
For the most part, people drive straight through Mililani when they're trying to get to the North Shore. Unless they have to stop at Costco or Walmart, I'm going to say not really, and I'll keep it short.
Oh, that was well done. Alexander.
I concur.
Oh, but even better. Touche. And the last question and their last answer, and then I will just have a few concluding remarks, is there's so much we could have talked about, but what one issue that's really of concern to District 38 did you not get a chance to address that you would like to? I think we'll start with Alexander first and then Lauren.
In the past couple of weeks, on the eastern shore of the United States, there's been a lot of hurricanes impacting Florida.
There's one right now?
Yeah, there's one right now heading towards Florida. We have weather reporters breaking down on live television. It's pretty scary. And one issue that I've been disappointed by from our state and local governments is how we're handling climate change. And it is going to be a problem for my generation a lot. I'm probably going to see whatever the next Yankee is, whatever the next Milton, is it called?
Milton, yeah, described as a monster hurricane, currently Category 5. Or it was an hour ago.
Yeah, and it's an inevitability. And I think in terms of mitigating that, there's been a disappointing amount of progress, I'll say from my own party, but another disappointing doesn't really get to how I feel about some of our Republican leaders, federally and more locally is not just it's like a skepticism and allowing for conspiracy theorists to just take this really important pressing issue that is going to impact everyone, including our youngest children, people born after me. They're also going to see the impacts of climate change, and that is something that I would want to work on.
Okay, Lauren, to you, climate change, and he also mentioned President Trump, who at the very top, who may be our next president, saying essentially that it's a hoax, and even if we do have climate change, you're going to have more beachfront property. He's actually said that publicly. Although I'm not asking you to respond for the president, but your views on Hawaii, a view in particular. Sorry, and let me just rephrase my own question, or repeat it rather. What's an issue that we haven't addressed tonight that you feel is important for your district?
And I have a lot to say about disaster preparedness. We've had several town halls here in Mililani because we had the huge fire up in Mililani and have been successful to work with DOT to create the first emergency exit road out of Mililani. And that has been a great accomplishment there. But the issue I wanted to talk about was the cost of childcare. We talk about cost of living all the time, but one of the big issues for Mililani is we have so many families, and the cost of childcare and the supply of childcare is so low. So I have 2 children, my son Noah and Noel, and when I was putting them both through preschool, Noel's still in preschool, it cost me $40,000 a year to put my kids through childcare. And that's not going to some super fancy preschool, it's going to the church preschool down the road. But that is a reality that so many of our families are facing. And not to mention that I had to be on a wait list for a year and a half to be able to get my child into a more affordable childcare. So my son had to go to 3 different preschools because I was slowly trying to get into the one that my family could afford most. And so this is a huge issue, something that's not talked about enough. I'm so happy that Governor Sylvia Luke has been working on this issue. And if you talk about bipartisanship, the poster child for her preschool programs, my daughter, because it's
literally the poster child.
The poster child, literally the poster child. She is the picture. But
Noelle.
Noelle is the picture. But again, this is an issue that is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects everybody, and especially all of our working families here in Mililani.
Okay, thank you very much. This will be posted online. Give us a couple of days. We'll get it up there. You'll see all of our candidate forums on the homepage. You can't miss them. We have a couple more coming up, including later this week. You can also read about that on Civil Beat. Remember, the ballots go out October the 18th. Please vote. And finally, would you please give a big round of applause to Lauren Matsumoto and Alexander Ozawa. For Honolulu Civil Beat, I'm Chad Blair. Grab some food on the way out and come up and say hello to the candidates. You guys have been terrific. Thank you very much.